Hello everyone, I'm Scratch from Snake Eyes MTG, and today we're going to be presenting you another episode of Pioneering Modern. Today I'll be joined by my two good friends. On the bottom left we have Anthony, and on the bottom right we have Joe. So Joe,
Hey
how are you
guys.
doing?
Yeah, not too bad. Thank you very much. It's nice weather. Enjoying the weekend. Um,
Okay, and then we also have Anthony. How are you doing?
I am actually in a fantastic mood and very happy to be here.
The aim of today's podcast is to present you with some modern decks that you would be able to play. Each of us will be bringing a deck of the archetypes that we are most comfortable and most fan of playing. As
Yep.
always, I'll be presenting you guys with control. When it comes to the mana base, it's a pretty simple mana base. Just trying to find the correct colors to cast your spells. Um, Notable exceptions are Colonnade, which is a creature land allowing you to have the ability to deal damage. It's another win con. Sometimes you just run out of win cons and your lands have to do
Mhm.
it for you. I have been in
Oh
those
yeah.
scenarios. Hall of Storm Giants, same thing. Personally, I
Mhm.
like Colonnade more because it flies, and flying is a very good one. Another very, very important land is Castle Vantress. This seems very, cool, but it is really good because sometimes your opponent doesn't do anything because they drew a land and they keep it in hand, but they don't want to let you know. So you just end step scry 2, and then you are the one that came out on top during that turn cycle. We got, because this is a deck running Prismatic Ending, and most decks are running Prismatic Ending in the control section. This could be Esper control or Bant control, but they are mostly running Prismatic Ending in order to get the third color, so they can exile stuff with CMC 3, mana value 3, however you want to call it. They run a Triome. This deck is running the Jeskai Triome, known as Ralgreen Triome, Jeskai being blue, white, red. And in the Triomes, tap for 3 colors can be cycled, very, very important. And yeah, it just enters the battlefield tap, but is fetchable with your fetch lands. You also have a 1 of Steam Vents in this list. If it will be big, now it's bigger. Steam Vents allowing you to pay life to get it into play untapped if you needed a red source immediately. The rest is just, basic land, just some basic stuff that you'd find in almost any list, where you have some islands, some fetches, and just basically trying to mana fix into your necessities. Opts provide your deck with two main functions. They provide you with the ability in the late game to have a slightly better top deck because you can top deck an opt, and if you have 5, 6, 7 lands, you can cast the opt and then still cast whatever came off the top, making it a very good one. And then in the early game, it helps you find either the needed answers or the needed lands, because sometimes you keep a two-lander but you need like 3, 4 lands. This allows you in the early game to fetch an untapped source, cast an op turn 1, and then see how the game goes afterwards. um, then we talk about Dress Down. Dress Down is a nice one. This one has some very niche interactions, but sometimes this is just a cantrip, and sometimes you kill Construct tokens with it. Sometimes, some creatures like Kavu can be killed with Dress Down. So really just depends on the situation. But a lot of times I'll just cycle this turn 2 if I need to dig for more lands or dig for answers. There's nothing wrong with cycling it. It's just like cycling Shark Typhoon for 0.
Mhm. Mhm.
Snapcaster Mage provides you with a late game threat, whilst at the same time also providing you with a value engine because it lets you get any spell from the graveyard back. Counterspell, just the good old Counterspell, best card. I think best blue card in Modern. Straight up 2 mana, answers whatever you need it to answer. Nothing wrong with it. Archmage's Charm, I think, is one of the more important cards that has recently come up, and that is Archmage's Charm has the ability, because of its versatility, to do a lot. First of all, in like the worst case scenario, you can always use it as a counter spell. You can do that, but usually it's just better to use either of the other two modes. Draw 2, allowing you to gain card advantage on your opponent, and then at the same time you also have the other ability to gain control of target non-land permanent with mana value 1 or less. This also has the ability to allow you to get a 2-for-1, basically being card advantage against your opponent. Because one thing that you cannot forget when playing control is a lot of times because you're playing 6, 7, 8 lands, and your opponent only wants 4 lands, and if they only draw 4 lands, you're basically down 4 cards against your opponent due to you playing more lands.
Mhm.
And this is a nice way of being able to equalize that, and then after you've equalized, you then keep pushing forward, and then you gain just so much card advantage that your opponent is just unable to come back.
Mhm.
Teferi Time Raveler is a card I really dislike. I really dislike that card, but it is a very powerful card. It has the ability to bounce something and draw you a card, which is nice, a nice tempo play. It has
Mhm.
the uptick ability that lets you cast sorceries as though they had flash. Not always relevant, but better than nothing. It's an uptick. You just want that Teferi to go up sometimes. And the static ability is actually Teferi's biggest ability, or I guess the static and the -3, being the static that opponents can only cast spells as though they were sorceries, um, which really limits
Mm.
some spells. Like Counterspell basically can't do anything because Counterspell won't work, and like the Cascade decks won't be able to cascade into their spells. So
Mhm.
some decks really get hit by this really hard, but the static and the minus is really what makes this card very big. Um, the Let's go to the win cons a bit later. We got Memory Deluge as a way to dig for cards and then just have great card advantage. This card in this deck can be a 4-for-1, which is really good at being able to power through sometimes. Trying to get those cards. Supreme Verdict, a sweeper. Sometimes your opponent overwhelms the board, so you just need
Mhm.
to destroy all creatures and then to pick up the game afterwards. Fire Ice, which is one of the only, or technically only red spell in the deck. Usually you just cast the ice portion just to tap your opponent out of mana in the early turns. This really allows you to just sometimes delay them, and then, control decks usually have better late game. So it doesn't really matter what happens, is you're just trying to delay the game to a point where all your spells are just much more impactful. A
Mhm.
Ragavan is great in the early game, but there are just cards in the late game that are just so much better than a Ragavan. Like Solitude, which is, an answer whilst at the same time also being a threat. If you top deck Solitude in the late game and your opponent top decks a Ragavan, they dash Ragavan, you Solitude it away, and then you have a 3/2 lifelinker.
Mhm.
You are the one that came out in the exchange. Prismatic Ending is also one of those cards that is a removal spell, but this one's a very versatile one because it hits almost anything under the sun except for Urza's Saga. That's what your dress down is for, though. Um, the Teferi Hero of Dominaria is one of your main win cons. Its
Mhm.
ability to ultimate is just game ending, and usually the ultimate is not needed because a lot of times the just straight up card advantage and mana advantage that Teferi provides is so huge that you just win off of that. Um,
Mhm.
and then what I would consider to be one of the main win cons nowadays in any kind of white-based control deck, this could be blue-white, red, blue-white, black, is the Wandering Emperor, usually found between 1 and 2 copies, 2 copies in this list. This really allows you to just exile a creature, or if really want to ramp up the pressure, you cast this and you make multiple samurais. When I play it, either I exile a creature and then minus her to make a samurai. I know it's flashier to keep her on board, but most of the times the 2/2 is just much more impactful than her getting attacked by another creature. Because a lot of times your opponent has 2 creatures, you exile the big boy, small boy is still around, and the 2/2 would profitably trade with it, and then you get a 2-for-1 because the Wandering Emperor dealt with the 2/2, plus it dealt with a big creature with the exile
Mhm.
effect. So the Wandering Emperor is just a great value engine that has also the ability to be flashed in and just be a threat because you can flash it in end step and just make token, token, uptick, token, and just really just get ahead on the board.
Yeah,
Um,
Yeah.
anytime a 4 mana spell makes an impact in eternal formats like Modern and Legacy, even
yeah,
it's seeing play in Vintage as well.
it sees play in
Yeah.
Legacy in Jeskai Control in Legacy because it's got
Mm.
the ability to not be pyroblasted. That is
Yeah.
the main reason it's
Hmm.
being played is because it gets around pyroblast. I like
Yeah.
the Wandering Emperor a lot, and I bought mine when she was still not on the hype, so I got really
Yay.
lucky on that, and or I was really clever about that because I saw the potential in this card, and it just is a nice way of sometimes. Another very important part about this card is end step baiting in control, because sometimes in
Hmm.
control you cast some spells end step to force your opponents to react, and then using that, you can cast spells in the following turn a little bit differently. Because sometimes if you end step cast a Wandering Emperor, and your opponent responds by, going Archmage's Charm, counter it, and you go Counterspell, and then they throw another Archmage's Charm at it, or they throw a Counterspell at it, doesn't really matter what happens, and your opponent tapped 5 mana, then in the following turn you might be able to resolve it to Fairy with a Counterspell backup.
Yep.
So this is a very important tool, as just in order to get your Teferi Time Ravelers or Teferi Hero of Dominarius through sometimes.
Yeah.
And also against
for
one.
sure. The other thing I wanted to say about the Wandering Emperor as well is if you leave it alone, it takes over the game.
Yeah, I did that once against it was, I think, blue-white control deck, and my opponent end step cast Memory Deluge, and I said in response to, I let them have their Memory Deluge, because you always let them have the cantrip first, because then they take the cards without knowing that there'll be a Wandering Emperor. And then in my end step, before the turn got passed, I flashed in my Wandering Emperor, and my opponent just was not able to deal with that Emperor in a sufficient way, and I just just grinded out the game with my Wandering Emperor. It's a very good card at grinding as well, just making tokens, giving them first strike. It is a very good one. Also, one thing you can do is flash her in during your turn and uptick it to give a creature you control first strike. Has been relevant in the past. I have blown people out by that. Going to the sideboard, we have Celestial Purge, just a nice way of being able to deal with some of the more important cards like Ren and Six, Liliana, Death Shadow. It's a nice way of dealing with black and red permanents, as it says in the card. Spreading Seas, gotta hate on Saga. Saga is something that gets hated on a lot. Mystical Dispute, every control deck has very cheap anti-control cards. This deck is choosing Mystical Dispute as its choice. Not my personal cup of tea, but it is not the wrong move. This is definitely something that preference would play into.
What would you play?
I personally play Flusterstorm in this instance, because Flusterstorm hits a lot more decks that I want it to hit. If I'm playing against something like, because my build is a bit different, I'm not running Chalice. If I'm running against kind of burn decks, the Flusterstorm allows you in the early game to be able to deal with their cards at a much more efficient rate, and then get to the late game cards hoping to, maybe get Wandering Emperors and down ticker to gain life, cast Lightning Helixes, just a bunch of very important cards that you need to get to, and cheap interaction versus burn is very important, and that's why I personally run Flusterstorms, but Mystical Dispute is not a wrong option. Summary Dismissal, this is for the people who don't play Subtlety, but the general meta is not playing Subtlety, but they are also playing a bit more of a tap-out control deck, which the Summary Dismissal much more complements this tap-out strategy. And the important part about this is to get the Titan decks, or any kind of decks that are trying to get uncounterable spells, you are able to deal with it, with the Summary Dismissal. But do keep in mind, Summary Dismissal also exiles your own spells. So it is a very bad way of protecting your spells. Just to keep that in mind.
So you can't use it in a counter war then?
You can use it in counter war.
Well,
it's depending on if you're countering your opponent's spell. Because if your opponent is casting something, and you cast the Summary Dismissal because you have to, and you exile your own counterspell with it, doesn't really matter. But if you cast it to a Wandering Emperor end step, and back her up with a Summary Dismissal, you're not gaining anything.
Yeah,
no, it'll counter your own spell for sure.
Yeah, if you counter your opponent's Teferi with it, it's a completely different thing than if you counter your own, than if you counter your Wandering Emperor with it. That's very important to keep in mind. It's very it's non-decisive. Everything gets exiled. Dovin's Veto, one of my favorite cards currently, actually, because it deals with Cascade, and Cascade is such a problematic deck in this format. If you're running Chalice of the Void, it's much better. Teferi's a great way of dealing with it. But I think one of the best cards against it is Dovin's Veto, because no matter what you do, unless they have Grief, they cannot deal with that Dovin's Veto. It's, they cast it, Dovin's Veto it, and they just have to say, it happens. Similar thing on Flusterstorm. Flusterstorm just loses a bit of value in the later portions of the game. But keep in mind that anytime they cascade, they will always have to. They always are forced to first cast a spell and then cascade into a second spell. So if you just cast an opt in response and then Flusterstorm, you're able to Flusterstorm for 4, which is pretty hard to deal with in most cases.
Yeah.
You have one more Supreme Verdict. This is for the aggro kind of matchups. I very not like this against Burn because it's just not efficient against Burn. Against Burn, they usually have very low to the cost, low to the ground creatures that you just want to deal with on a one-to-one basis. But this is kind of for your kind of like creature-based mid-range aggro decks. So Soul Guide Lantern is the graveyard hate of choice in this iteration of Control. Control always should have graveyard hate. A lot of decks have been running Rest in Peace in the past. Snapcaster Mage is preventing you from being able to use it. I personally prefer Relic over Soul Guide Lantern, but Soul Guide Lantern is not a wrong choice, to say the least. And then we have the Chalice of the Void. Chalice of the Void is very important. These decks can easily sideboard out their opts, and then at that point you can cast Prismatic Ending. You can overpay for a Prismatic Ending on a 1-drop. That is not a problem. So you can easily cast Prismatic Ending on 0 versus Cascade decks, or you can cast it on 1 versus any kind of aggro, like Shadow decks get hit pretty hard by it, or the Murktide decks get hit pretty hard by it, or the also the Burn decks get hit pretty hard by it. So it's got some pretty nice versatility in which matchups you want to bring it in against. Depending on the build of Control, you can easily play a Chalice or not easily play a Chalice, depending on if you're running opts or not. So if you were to talk about how you would want to go against any kind of these Cascade decks, because we were talking about, playing against Cascade, one of the very easy things about Cascade is that you know that your Prismatic Endings are basically useless.
Yeah.
So against that deck, it's pretty easy. What you can do is you bring in the Chalice, you bring in the Dovin's Veto. I would bring in the Mystical Dispute to fight their forces. The Summary Dismissal is not needed, it's just too inefficient. And what you can do is you can bring out the 4 Prismatic Endings, and the card that I usually also bring out in most cases would be the Dress Down, because Dress Down, it's not the card I want to have in hand when my opponent is casting a Living End. It's just I much rather have Dovin's Veto, Mystical Dispute, or Chalice, because don't forget the Mystical Dispute can be hard cast for 3 mana to mana leak their spell, which is very relevant, and I have actually done that in the past against non-blue spells because it just comes up. It's a relevant thing. What was the other matchup that you would the top matchups we had?
4-color.
4-color against 4-color. It's pretty simple. I'd usually bring out the Verdicts, bring in the Mystical Disputes. You can also bring in the Summary Dismissals to increase the amount of counter magic you have in that kind of a matchup. What else would you cut? It's pretty hard to cut something from the list. Maybe you could trim on an ending or 2, but the Summary Dismissal shouldn't be your number. Oh, the Dovin's Vetoes. Yeah, Dovin's Vetoes also. So you can. It's a pretty hard one. It really depends on the flavor of it, because not all 4-color decks are built equally, and the Mystical Dispute comes in no matter which one you're going up against, because you have to answer those to fairies. But depending on the build, you might want to bring in a Dovin's Veto or 2 in order to increase the amount of counterspells that you have against that deck. And sometimes you just trim on a Prismatic Ending because it's not your biggest card in that matchup. But you can also trim on Dress Downs. It's really depending on how if they might be running Risen Reef. I have seen some 4-color decks not be elemental decks or not call themselves elemental decks, but still run Risen Reef. So it really just depends on the archetypes. So you can't make on 4-color. It's pretty hard to make a hard given rule.
Yeah.
So that's something that you have to know about playing Control versus that matchup. Against Murktide, it's pretty simple. You go in with the Chalices, in with the Mystical Dispute, and you go out with the Dress Down, because Dress Down is not your most important card in that matchup. And you can trim on an Opt. It's a very easy one to trim on, and then what else do we trim? Depending on play and draw, sometimes you can trim a Charm. Sometimes you just have to be a bit on that. I would keep in a Supreme Verdict to 1 to 2 Supreme Verdicts, because sometimes they overload the board, and also Supreme Verdict deals with Murktide, where not all of the cards in your deck deal with Murktide. So it's very important to have some number of answers to it. But you can easily also trim down to 1 Verdict. It's not a problem. It might just have to be on play and draw dependent, because on the play you need less verdicts because you're ahead on mana, but on the draw, the second verdict, in my opinion, would be something I would consider to be very crucial, not necessary, but definitely very good to have. Yeah, and I think that should cover having a sideboard plan against some decks. I think the biggest thing I can give to you as a learning or wanting to learn how to play control is a lot of control decks. You can't give hard and fast rules on how to sideboard, because in control you have to assess the threats and then deal with the threats that you deem as a threat. Because if your opponent casts an Arbor Elf, it's not a threat unless it ramps into something that's a threat. So it really just depends on what you consider to be the threat in the given deck. You only bolt the bird if you need to bolt the bird, because sometimes if you have triple Counterspell in hand, that bolt might as well just be saved for a 3-drop that has 3 toughness, and then you just counter everything that comes down. It's just no matter what comes down, you're countering it. So it really depends.
And it becomes a play draw sort of thing there. So, for example, if I played a pillage on the play on turn 2, then because you know that you're on the draw, you need to hit that elf so that I can't cast the pillage on turn 2. But
Yeah.
if it's the other way around, if you're on the play and I'm on the draw, then you know that the elf, you're not quite as scared of it as
Yeah, definitely. It also depends on your hand. If you're holding a bunch of Archmage's charms and you need to get to turn 3, because Archmage's charm does not work on turn 2, you have to then at that point cast the Prismatic Ending or evoke the Solitude. And sometimes evoking the Solitude on a mana dork is the correct line of play. You cannot dispute that, not mystically. I have to make one very important line of text. I have to point out the Wandering Emperor once more. Yawgmoth, a matchup that I prepare for with my Jeskai control deck, because I play actual Jeskai control deck. If you play Bolt or Fire, which in the case of blue-white, the Wandering Emperor upticks on any creature. It does not have to be your own creature. So against Yawgmoth, you can put the +1/+1 counter on an undying creature, and then fire it, then bolt it, and then it does not come back with the undying trigger because it died with a counter on it. Yeah, I saw the card and I was like, does it say every creature? Because I looked at it and I assume the reasoning for why it says all creatures is because target creature you control does not fit in the text box unless they make the text box a bit different. And so they didn't have enough space in it. And I looked at the card, and I was like wondering if that interaction was gonna be something that happened. And I looked it up, and then looked at it, and I was like, oh, it says any creature. And so I realized that was a very legitimate line against Yawgmoth. So I think all 3 of these decks have been a very interesting take on how to tackle the format known as Modern. How we can pioneer through this. And in these modern times, it's very good to have a strong deck. That's why I think they were all very nice. Now it's not just time to hear us ramble and talk about what decks there are and what sideboard cards we like. We would also like to hear from you guys what your favorite sideboard card is. So please let us know. What's the spiciest or the most interesting or favorite sideboard card that you currently see or play in this current modern meta? Well then, have a good one. See ya.
See you later, everybody.
Take it easy.